This is the introductory education programme for supporters of FRFI. Its structure serves its purpose by establishing the need for organisation in order to meet the crisis of capitalism and fight for socialism. This programme is in no way fixed and is open to suggestions. It remains therefore a work in progress. It is being discussed in open forums across the country where FRFI supporters are active. In this section, we'll be discussing the need for communist organisation today. Capitalism means war, crisis, deepening poverty and environmental destruction on an ever-increasing scale. There is no future for humanity in a capitalist world. Whilst the resistance of the working class is spontaneously revolutionary, only through the fusion of such a struggle with Marxist thought can there be created a new communist movement capable of challenging capitalism. Hence, the struggle to defend the ideas and principles of Marxism is critical to creating the movement of the future. The material conditions of imperialism give rise to opportunist layers in the working class movement in imperialist countries which seek to reconcile the interests of the oppressed and the oppressors. Without ruthlessly exposing these currents, no revolutionary movement can emerge. Without political organisation, no crisis of the capitalist system will ever of itself give way to socialism. Organisation is our only weapon. To start off with, we're going to look at the article Imperialism and the Split in the Working Class, first published in FRFI number 253 in October 2016. Members and supporters of the Revolutionary Communist Group attended the conference celebrating 50 years since the first Tricontinental held in Havana, Cuba in 1966. The event, Legacies of the Tricontinental, Imperialism, Resistance, Law, was held at the University of Coimbra, Portugal, on the 22nd to the 24th of September 2016. The 1966 Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia and Latin America, or the Tricontinental, was attended by over 500 representatives from national liberation movements and governments from some 82 countries. Among the delegates in 1966 were Fidel Castro, Salvador Allende and Amilcar Cabral. The first Tricontinental condemned imperialism, colonialism and neocolonialism and pledged solidarity with the Vietnamese people's struggle against US imperialism. Che Guevara sent a message of solidarity before leaving for Bolivia, saying, "Create 2, 3, many Vietnams. That is the watchword." Today, workers and oppressed people of the world face many of the same issues that were addressed in 1966. What follows are two of the contributions made at the conference by David Yaffe and Trevor Rain. In Marxism Today, January 1990, the British communist historian Eric Hobsbawm, who in his earlier Communist Party days did much to revive the discussion of the issue of the labour aristocracy, made a reactionary and pessimistic assessment of the situation at the time of the collapse of the socialist bloc, when he wrote, "Insofar as we envisage a change in the nature of capitalism, it will not, within the foreseeable future, be through a basic catastrophic crisis of the capitalist system, out of which the only thing that can be saved is by revolutionary means." Certainly from the 50s on, it's been quite clear that, for instance, the argument that capitalism is no longer viable economically disappeared. It is more than viable. End quote. On this basis, he saw no justification for the split in the working class movement between communists and social democratic trends. Quote, "The split in the labour movement, which was introduced after the 1917 revolution, no longer has any justification. The case for the split between the communist and social democratic movements, I believe, falls by the wayside." End quote. Hobsbawm could not see the resurgence of a working class movement committed to the overthrow of the capitalist system because he could not envisage a catastrophic crisis of that system. From his standpoint, the opportunist role of social democracy in undermining spontaneous working class revolt against capitalism is of little consequence. That is why he argued that the split in the working class movement between communists and social democratic movements was no longer justified, nor the need to build separate communist parties. Today, a quarter of a century later, it is Hobsbawm's position that lacks credibility, as it becomes evident that years after the financial crash of 2008 and 9, that we are experiencing a seemingly unending crisis of global capitalism. It is no exaggeration to say that capitalism suffers from long-term contradictions which increasingly threaten its destruction. This is the context in which Lenin's standpoint on imperialism and the split in the working class is as relevant today in all essential aspects as it was in his day. Imperialism not only divides the world into oppressed and oppressor nations, but divides the working class into a privileged labour aristocracy, bribed out of the super profits of imperialism, and the mass of the working class. This privileged stratum is the social basis of opportunism in the working class movement. Lenin's position on the split in the working class, put forward during a catastrophic crisis of the capitalist system, is a development and generalisation of Marx and Engels' position on the working class in Britain in the last half of the 19th century. Marx and Engels show how opportunistic currents grew out of the special features of the development of capitalism in the most industrially advanced capitalist countries of their time. The further development of Marx and Engels' position on this question is the key to understanding Lenin's theory of imperialism, for two important distinguishing features of imperialism were already present in Britain in the middle of the 19th century: vast colonial possessions and a monopolistic position in the world market. Marx and Engels used their analysis of British capitalism, the most developed capitalist country at the time and the dominant world power, to point to what were to become some of the crucial characteristics of capitalism in its imperialist phase. Lenin, in his pamphlet on imperialism, directly refers to these developments within British capitalism, in particular to underline his explanation of the growth of opportunism and the split in the working class movement internationally. Quote, "It must be observed that in Great Britain, the tendency of imperialism to split the workers, to strengthen opportunism among them, and cause temporary decay in the working class movement, revealed itself much earlier than the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. For two important distinguishing features of imperialism were already observed in Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century: vast colonial possessions and a monopolistic position on the world market. Marx and Engels trace this connection between opportunism in the working class movement and the imperialistic features of British capitalism systematically during the course of several decades." End quote. Here, opportunism is given a materialist basis in the characteristics of capitalism associated with imperialism. Engels makes this clear on the 8th of October 1858 in a letter to Marx about Ernest Jones, a leader of the revolutionary wing of the Chartist movement, who called a conference to bring about collaboration between the working class and the middle class reformers. Quote, "The English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that the ultimate aim of this most bourgeois of all nations would appear to be the possession, alongside the bourgeoisie, of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat. In the case of a nation which exploits the entire world, this is, of course, justified to some extent. Only a couple of thoroughly bad years might help here." End quote. Engels not only gives opportunism a materialist basis, associating it with Britain's domination of the world market, but also points to the conditions which would contribute to changing the state of affairs: a few thoroughly bad years. Perhaps the most substantial statement of Marx and Engels' position was made by Engels in 1885. Quote, "The truth is this. During the period of England's industrial monopoly, the English working class have, to a certain extent, shared in the benefits of monopoly. These benefits were unequally parcelled out amongst them. The privileged minority pockets the most, but even the great mass had, at least, a temporary share now and then. And that is the reason why, since the dying out of Owenism, there has been no socialism in England. With the breakdown of that monopoly, the English working class will lose that privileged position, and it will find itself, generally, the privileged and leading minority not accepted, on a level with its fellow workers abroad. And that is the reason why there will be no socialism again in England." End quote. Marx shared this view. He stated at the Hague Congress of the First International in 1872 that so-called leaders of the English workers are more or less bribed by the bourgeoisie and the government. They had taken payments from the liberal bourgeoisie to work for the Liberal Party in the 1868 election. On the 20th of September 1871, at a session of the London Conference of the First International, Marx referred to the trade unions as an aristocratic minority. "The poorer workers," he said, "cannot belong to them. The great mass of workers, driven from the countryside to the towns by economic development, have long been outside of them, and the most wretched mass, including workers born in the East End in London, have never belonged." During the third quarter of the 19th century, Britain's monopoly of the world market was being challenged by German, French and US capitalism. The narrow aristocratic trade unionism and liberalism among the working class began to be undermined. Conditions for the working class worsened. The class struggle intensified. Socialist organisations emerged, and the unskilled workers, encouraged and supported by socialists, were organised in new unions in the last decade of the 19th century. It was in this period that Engels referred to old unions as a bourgeois Labour Party after their defeat at the 1891 TUC Congress in their attempt to overthrow trade union support for the 8-hour day, passed at the previous year's conference. His revolutionary optimism in this period gives some guidance to revolutionary tactics. Quote, "The new unions were founded at a time when the faith in the eternity of the wage system was severely shaken. Their founders and promoters were socialists, either consciously or by feeling. The masses, whose adhesion gave them strength, were rough, neglected, looked down upon by the working class aristocracy. But they had this immense advantage, that their minds were virgin soil, entirely free from the inherited respectable bourgeois prejudices which hampered the brains of the better situated old Unionists." End quote. Lenin was to bring out the practical political implications of this position in the midst of imperialist war. Engels, he says, draws a distinction between the bourgeois Labour Party of the old trade unions, the privileged minority, and the lowest masses, the real majority, and appeals to the latter, who are not infected by bourgeois respectability. This is the essence of Marxist tactics. This is the essence of Marxist tactics. Engels' revolutionary optimism proved unjustified. The next 25 years saw the inevitable conflict between the liberal Labour leadership, which dominated the political and trade union organisations of the labour movement, and the mass of the working class. The new unions did win major victories against the old unions and the employers, but in the end, leaders such as John Burns, Ben Tillett, and Keir Hardie were not able to resist the opportunism of the old union structure with its army of well-paid and bought-off officials. Marx pointed to the development of monopoly imminent in capital accumulation. As a result of competition, the centralisation and concentration of capital takes place throughout the accumulation process, that is, the growth of ever larger concentrations of capital, or monopolies. Capitalist production, Marx argued, exists in most adequate form insofar as free competition develops. Nevertheless, as soon as capital feels itself threatened, it will seek refuge in other forms, which appear to perfect its rule as capital through curbs on free competition. Marx offers here a clear context for beginning to understand capitalism in its imperialist phase. It is precisely the nature of capital itself and the preservation of its rule as capital that is central for an understanding of capitalism in its monopoly stage. It has not ceased to be capital by virtue of the curbs on free competition. On the contrary, it is precisely the rule of capital that makes the curbs on free competition necessary. Marx continues, although the curbs on free competition appear to complete the mastery of capital, they are at the same time, by curbing free competition, the heralds of its dissolution, and the dissolution of the mode of production which are based on it. This important point is clearly central to Lenin's description of monopoly capitalism at the highest stage of capitalism, and his view that monopoly is the transition from capitalism to a higher stage. At the centre of Lenin's analysis was recognition of the general revolutionary character of the whole imperialist epoch, and is a guide to practical political activity in that epoch. Lenin shows how imperialism divides the world between oppressed and oppressor nations, how it brings about class differentiation within both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, with the existence of a purely parasitic financiers or rentier class and the labour aristocracy, and how the different pace of development of monopoly capitalism in different countries drives nations into conflicts that can only be resolved by force, that is, by war. Imperialism is characterised by parasitism and decay of capitalism. A handful of exceptionally rich and powerful states plunder the world by simply clipping coupons out of these super profits of imperialism. Out of these super profits of imperialism, it is possible to bribe the labour leaders and the upper stratum of the labour aristocracy. This stratum of the bourgeoisified workers, or the labour aristocracy, are the real agents of the bourgeoisie within the working class movement, the labour lieutenants of the capitalist class, real channels of reformism and chauvinism. The future history of the labour movement will be determined by the outcome of the struggle between these two opposing tendencies, between imperialism's effectiveness in sustaining the political privileges and SOPs of the top layers of the working class represented by bourgeois labour parties, and the resistance of the increasingly oppressed masses who bear the brunt of imperialism and imperialist war. Lenin argues that, quote, unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its political and social significance appreciated, not a step can be taken towards the solution of the practical problem of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. End quote. The political significance of the split in the working class movement has a lot of relevance today. Many new books from left-wing and Marxist writers are being produced on the current crisis of capitalism or imperialism. Some offer us a robust critique of imperialism, the super-exploitation of the oppressed nations and growing inequality. Yet they ignore the political significance of the split in the working class movement in the main capitalist or imperialist countries. In contrast to Lenin, In contrast to Lenin, many of these writers see the vast majority of the working class in the imperialist countries as beneficiaries, to a greater or lesser extent, of the super-exploitation of the working class and peasantry in the oppressed nations. They therefore reject the existence of a material foundation for the unity of the working class in the oppressor and oppressed nations in the fight against imperialism. In other words, they underestimate the depth of the crisis of capitalism in the imperialist countries. In Britain, under Thatcher's government in the 1980s, it was already clear that it was no longer possible to guarantee the relatively privileged conditions of higher paid workers and the middle classes, while sustaining adequate living standards for the mass of the working class. This reality was acutely driven home in many imperialist countries after the financial crash of 2008-2009. The split in the working class is a tangible reality. After Lenin died, capitalism, with its bourgeois labour parties, survived 2 world wars and fascism. This has occurred with a continual change in the makeup of the privileged strata of the working class over more than 100 years, and in Britain more than 150 years. At first it was composed of skilled manual workers. Now it is mainly made up of highly paid white-collar workers in the public and service sectors. Workers formerly among the most privileged sections of the working class, engineers, miners, steel workers, were thrown into the ranks of the unemployed as the economy was restructured to serve the rapacious needs of capital accumulation. New privileged workers took their place in the labour organisations which had been created to sustain the political influence of a privileged minority of the working class and undermine spontaneous working class opposition to capitalism. A change to the character of the labour aristocracy, however, in no way makes it redundant. As the communist writer John Foster pointed out, to see this as the end would be to miss the whole essence of the labour aristocracy. To see it purely descriptively, in just one of its forms, and ignore its historical role and development, as the active process by which labour's class organisation was purged of anti-capitalist elements and made safer for economism and spontaneity." End quote. The effectiveness of this new active process, of the elevation of new sections of the working class to a level of privilege previously enjoyed by skilled workers, is tied to the ability of imperialism economically to sustain these privileged layers and their political influence over the working class movement through recurring crisis of the capital accumulation process. The failure to grasp this reality has deactivated the movement against cuts in state welfare, austerity, war, and ever-increasing poverty in the main capitalist countries today. Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain were able to curb the spontaneous struggle against the brutal austerity imposed by the Troika on the mass of people in those countries because of the absence of political organisations prepared and ready to take up the fight against the opportunist leadership of those struggles. Similar developments are taking place in Britain, as new political organisations such as Momentum emerge, alongside much of the radical left and key trade unions in support of the anti-austerity programme of Corbyn. These organisations will attempt to ensure that the fight against austerity does not cross any boundaries which would jeopardise the survival of a unified imperialist Labour Party. Similar developments are inevitably taking place in many other imperialist countries. As the imperialist crisis worsens, it is imperative that political organisations are formed determined to win the battle against opportunism in all its many modern forms. This is the lesson to be learnt from the history of the working class movement, first articulated by Marx and Engels and developed through Lenin's understanding of imperialism. Next we have an article from FRFI 173, published in June 2003. Titled "How the Campaign to Stop the War Was Sabotaged," it acts as an illustration of how opportunists seek to derail victory for the working class upon some of the most important questions facing society today, and so also points out the need to grow and develop communist organisation to combat these trends.
Supporting Labour's imperialist war. How the campaign to stop the war was sabotaged. Whilst opposition to the war in Iraq saw unprecedented numbers of ordinary people take to the streets all over the country, one thing was strikingly clear: the lack of any real opposition from within the Labour Party. Although a number of individual members and handful of councillors left the party in disgust, not one so-called anti-war Labour MP resigned the whip. This was no real surprise for those with any knowledge of Labour's bloody history and the left's contortions in justifying their continued support for it. Labour has always been a party that has defended the interests of British imperialism. Between 1914 and 1945, Labour supported the slaughter of the 1914-18 imperialist war. In the House of Commons, Labour MPs applauded the execution of James Connolly, a leader of the 1916 Irish Easter Uprising. The first Labour government used the RAF in 1924 to bomb and gas Kurds in Iraq in support of the British puppet administration. The second Labour government launched a brutal repression of the Indian nationalist movement, arresting thousands and killing hundreds using the army and the RAF. Labour supported the repression of the Palestinian uprising in 1935-39. Between 1945 and 1951, Labour brutally suppressed the Malayan national liberation struggle. They used troops to restore French colonial rule in Vietnam. They blockaded Iran after it nationalised the British-owned Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later BP. They ruthlessly exploited the British Empire in Africa to aid British post-war reconstruction. Between 1964 and 1970, Labour unconditionally supported the US onslaught on Vietnam. They defended apartheid South Africa, blocking all attempts to impose sanctions in the UN. They sent troops into the north of Ireland to defend the sectarian state, and they tortured suspected freedom fighters in Aden. Between 1974 and 1979, Labour continued to defend apartheid South Africa in the United Nations. They supported the Shah of Iran as he faced a mass popular uprising. They began selling Hawk aircraft to Indonesia during their genocidal war against the people of East Timor, and ran a ruthless torture regime against Republican prisoners in the north of Ireland. Throughout this period, Labour has been a Zionist party. In its 1944 conference, it called for the expulsion of the Palestinian people to make way for a Zionist state. Today it says hardly a word about the escalating slaughter of the Palestinian civilians in the West Bank and Gaza, offering its unconditional support to Israel in its supposed war on terror. In a cynical ploy prior to the start of the war, it begged the US to publish the roadmap for a Palestinian state to help bolster support for the impending onslaught. Whilst it was in opposition after Thatcher's victory in 1979, Labour supported the 1982 Malvinas Falklands War, and, in 1991, the First Gulf War. In the past 6 years in government, the Labour Party has waged more wars than the Tories did in the preceding 18. No Labour MP has resigned in this period over this record of incessant imperialist aggression. The so-called Labour left, the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and George Galloway, want to have their cake and eat it. They want to be able to criticise the Blair government, but are determined to remain as MPs representing the racist, imperialist Labour Party. But what was the strategy of the Stop the War coalition to prevent British participation in the war? It was to build a parliamentary alliance between pro-imperialist MPs who were tactically against the war unless it was endorsed by the UN, because they feared it would damage British imperialist interests in the Middle East. At the heart of the alliance were the Labour left MPs linked to Stop the War coalition: George Galloway, Jeremy Corbyn, and Alice Mahone. To establish the alliance, Stop the War coalition convener Lindsay German, a leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party, signed a letter to Blair in December of last year, which appealed to him to not engage in military activity against Iraq without the explicit authority of the United Nations and without an explicit decision of the House of Commons to do so. The letter was also signed by Alice Mahone and Jeremy Corbyn, and MPs from the Lib Dems, and Scottish and Welsh nationalists. It was the basis on which imperialist MPs such as Lib Dem leader Charles Kennedy was invited to speak from the platform at the huge 15th of February demonstration. Later on, Michael Foot at the 12th of April march. Yet this strategy was doomed to failure. The House of Commons has never voted against an imperialist war, and nor did it vote against the war in Iraq. A key prop for the Stop the War coalition's position was crude anti-Americanism, which allowed it to minimise British imperialist interests in the Middle East. Hence, Socialist Worker referred constantly to Blair as Bush's poodle. In January, at a Stop the War coalition conference, Lindsay German argued that, quote, "Now is the time to put on more pressure and break Blair from Bush. If Blair comes to think war will split the Labour Party, he will have to think again about supporting Bush." End quote. Socialist Worker, 18th of January. For the SWP and the Stop the War coalition, pressure on Blair meant mobilising respectable and therefore pro-imperialist voices to urge Labour to be more cautious in its gung-ho attack on Iraq, and not to follow the US. As Socialist Worker on the 15th of March put it, quote, "All those who oppose war, including MPs, ministers and cabinet members, have to make a stand, and now. They must be pressed to make clear to Blair that he has a simple choice: That is between his survival in office and support for Bush's war." End quote. The culmination of this strategy was the vote in the House of Commons on the 18th of March for an anti-war amendment, worded so as to appeal to any pro-imperialist MP who had concerns about a possible attack on Iraq. It stated that it, quote, "believes that the case for war in Iraq has not yet been proved, given the absence of specific UN authorization," end quote, and then went on to say that, quote, "in the event hostilities do emerge, it pledges its total support for the British forces engaged in the Middle East," end quote. Even with this craven pro-imperialist wording, the amendment fell, and with it fell the whole political strategy of the Stop the War coalition. All that Socialist Worker could do was complain impotently about the turncoat Charles Kennedy, leaving SWP and Stop the War coalition's John Rees to suggest on TV that one reason for opposing the war was to prevent the deaths of British troops in Iraq. The 15th of February demonstration, then, was historic in more ways than one, not only in its size, but also, more importantly, in exposing the political bankruptcy of the British left. The SWP and their allies were incapable of even beginning the task of politically educating the movement on the real nature of the British imperialist democracy, and the role of the Labour Party. Instead, Labour MPs that Stop the War coalition promoted as anti-war leaders, such as Jeremy Corbyn and Alex Mahone, used the anti-war movement to try and recruit members to their warmongering Labour Party. At a press conference on the 4th of March, the Labour left launched a Reclaim the Party for Peace initiative. Both Corbyn and Mahone urged Labour members disgusted with the war not to leave the party and appealed to anti-war activists, quote, "if you share our values, help us reclaim the Labour Party for peace," end quote. This was followed up by a conference of Labour Against the War on 29th of March, with trade union leaders Bob Crow from the RMT and Billy Hayes from the CWU among the main speakers. Both of those union leaders had previously issued militant-sounding declarations against the war, calling for industrial action, but both failed to deliver, hiding behind the anti-trade union laws to cover their refusal to confront the Labour government. Far from denouncing the way these politicians and trade union leaders touted for the racist and imperialist Labour Party, the Stop the War coalition continued to promote them on its platforms. The SWP and its allies in the Stop the War coalition bear direct responsibility for the collapse of the anti-war movement, from the 2 million on the streets on 15th of February to the 5,000 at the Rally for Palestine in Trafalgar Square on the 17th of May. There has been no political development of the movement. The same Labour left MPs and trade union leaders were promoted on the platform of the 12th of April national demonstration as on the 15th of February. Tony Benn could repeat his ridiculous claim that Britain is essentially a US colony to enthusiastic applause, while George Galloway could call on marchers to fight for him to remain in his reactionary imperialist party. A movement that allies itself to the Labour left, that sees electoral politics as the way forward, is a movement going nowhere. The challenge that faces all those who want to build an effective, anti-imperialist, anti-war movement is to break out of the suffocating politics of the Labour left and their allies in the Stop the War coalition. A new movement needs to reach out to the school students, the youth, and all those prepared to fight and ally with anti-imperialist forces in Palestine, Latin America, and other oppressed nations confronting imperialism. Article written by Bob Shepherd in FRFI 173.
Opportunism stems from a privileged layer of the working class split by imperialism. The Labour Party typically represents this privileged layer, but it is by no means the only way by which opportunism can manifest. It stems from a part of the working class, and so is a part of most movements that the working class has a stake in, and so the need to develop communist organisation and defend the long-term interests of the mass of the working class remains necessary today. You can support this important work by going to our website revolutionarycommunist.org or frfi.co.uk to get yourself a copy of the latest issue of FRFI, get yourself a subscription, or even inquire about joining or attending our public meetings and demonstrations.